Please help us." The little black girl begged the biker while red warning lights flickered above the conveyor rails. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. The air was thick with tension, the kind that comes just before something dangerous happens. The little girl, no older than 8 or 9, ran with all her might, her feet slapping against the cold concrete floor of the factory as red warning lights flashed above her. She was terrified, but her desperation pushed her forward. She spotted the group of bikers standing by their motorcycles, the sound of their engines still echoing in the background. She had no choice but to run toward them. Her heart was pounding in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she reached them, she gasped for breath, her voice trembling as she begged, "Please help us. They've taken my brother." The bikers turned their heads, surprised by the sudden appearance of the frightened child. The leader of the group, a man known only as Hawk, stepped forward. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. He had seen his fair share of trouble, but this was different. Something in the girl's eyes told him she wasn't lying. She was in real danger. "Where are they?" Hawk asked, his voice calm but firm. "Please, you have to hurry," the girl cried, pointing to a shadowy corner of the warehouse. The group of bikers exchanged looks, the weight of the situation settling on them. This wasn't just a random plea for help. Something about this felt personal, and they all knew it. Hawk looked over at his crew, who had gathered around him, awaiting orders. "All right, we're going," he said. "Stay close and stay quiet. We're not leaving until we get this girl's brother back." As they walked toward the area the girl had pointed to, the sound of their boots hitting the ground was the only thing breaking. The eerie silence. The girl, still trembling, clutched Hawk's sleeve, unwilling to let go. Hawk could feel the tension in her grip, but he knew they had to stay focused. The last thing they needed was to be caught off guard. The group moved quickly, navigating through the maze of machinery and conveyor belts, the red lights above casting long, ominous shadows. Hawk's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. Who would take a child's brother in the middle of a factory? And why was this little girl out here alone? It didn't make sense, but he wasn't about to question it now. They had a job to do, and the girl's life depended on them. As they neared the corner, Hawk's hand instinctively went to the gun at his waist. He didn't expect to use it, but he was prepared for anything. The girl looked up at him with wide eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please, they said they were going to hurt him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hawk's jaw tightened. Whoever these people were, they had no idea what they were about to face. He had made a promise to keep people safe, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter the cost. The group moved forward, ready for whatever came next, as the red warning lights flickered above them, casting an eerie glow on the path ahead. The group moved quickly through the dimly lit factory, each step deliberate and cautious. The little girl, still trembling, clutched onto Hawk's sleeve, her small fingers digging into the worn leather. Hawk glanced at his crew, each of them silently following, their expressions hardening with determination. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was personal. As they approached the area the girl had pointed to, the sounds of machinery and conveyor belts filled the air, mixing with the sharp clicks of their boots against the concrete floor. The red warning lights overhead cast an unsettling glow across the room, flickering intermittently, as if the very factory was holding its breath. Hawk's mind raced. Whoever had taken the girl's brother knew exactly what they were doing, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The girl's cries echoed in his ears, and he clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the promise he had made to her father. He had to keep her safe. They had to get her brother back, and fast. The group reached a narrow hallway lined with more machinery, the path barely wide enough for all of them to pass through. Hawk signaled for the team to stop. His eyes scanned the area, trying to assess any danger that might be lurking. "Stay alert," Hawk muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the hum of the factory. He turned to the girl. "Where did they take him?" She pointed down the hall to a small, dimly lit room at the end. "In there," she whispered, her voice shaking. They said they were going to hurt him if I didn't leave. Hawk nodded, his face a mask of focus. We're going in. Stay close to me, he instructed. He motioned for the others to fan out, the group moving into position with practiced precision. The air grew heavier with every step they took toward the room. The girls' breathing quickened as they approached the door. Hawk's hand hovered over the handle, and for a split second, he hesitated. He knew that whatever lay behind that door would change everything. He didn't know what kind of trouble they were walking into, but he was ready to face it head-on. He pushed the door open, the creak of the hinges cutting through the silence. The room was small, filled with dusty crates and unused equipment, but at the far end, there was a figure, a man standing with his back to them. And there, tied to a chair in the middle of the room, was the girl's brother, his face bruised and swollen. Hawk's eyes narrowed. The man turned slowly, his hand resting on the handle of a gun. The tension in the room thickened in an instant. I don't want any trouble, the man said, his voice gruff. But Hawk could see the fear in his eyes. He was just a pawn in someone else's game. Let the kid go, Hawk growled, his voice low and dangerous. The man's eyes flicked to the girl, who was standing at the doorway, still clinging to Hawk's side. You don't understand, the man said, taking a step back, his grip tightening on the gun. I don't have a choice. Hawk's pulse quickened. He knew they couldn't waste time talking. He had to act. You'll let him go, Hawk said, stepping forward, his voice cold. Or we'll make you. Without warning, Hawk lunged, disarming the man with a swift move. The gun clattered to the floor. The man tried to fight back, but Hawk's fist landed hard against his jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. The group rushed to untie the boy, whose eyes were wide with fear. The girl, now standing at the door, ran to her brother's side, wrapping her arms around him. Hawk stood over the man, watching as he struggled to regain his bearings. You're lucky, Hawk said, his voice low and steady. Next time, you won't be so fortunate. The man didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the floor. Hawk signaled to his crew. Let's go, he said. They had the boy. They had done what they came for. But Hawk knew this was far from over. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop just because they rescued one child. The night was far from over. As they made their way back through the factory, the sounds of the machines around them seemed louder, more oppressive, as if the very walls of the building were closing in on them. Hawk didn't look back. His focus was on getting the kids to safety, making sure they got out of here in one piece. They had to move quickly, but carefully. He wasn't about to let anyone else get hurt on his watch. The red warning lights flickered again above them, casting their ominous glow on the group as they made their way toward the exit. The mission wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, they had succeeded. The girl was safe. The boy was free. And that was all that mattered. The factory was silent now, the harsh hum of machinery replaced by the distant echo of their boots on the cold concrete floor. Hawk kept his eyes focused ahead, the weight of the night still pressing on his shoulders. The girl, Aisha, clung to her brother tightly, her small hands wrapped around him as if afraid he might disappear. Hawk could feel the tension in the air, the kind that comes when danger is still lurking just around the corner. His crew moved quickly, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of trouble. They were close to the exit now, but Hawk knew they weren't out of the woods yet. There was still a lot to be done. The man they had left behind was only the beginning. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just a simple kidnapping. Whoever was behind this had a plan, and they were not going to stop until they got what they wanted. Hawk turned to the crew. We need to get these kids out of here. Keep your eyes on the road. We can't afford any more surprises. The bikers nodded, their expressions hardening. They had been through enough to know when to trust their instincts. Hawk glanced down at Aisha, her face pale and streaked with tears, but there was a hint of relief in her eyes. At least her brother was safe. That was all that mattered right now. But Hawk couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep them safe. As they neared the exit, the sound of engines roared in the distance. Hawk's heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. It wasn't just the wind or the hum of the machines. It was the unmistakable growl of motorcycles. Hawk's hand went to his waist instinctively, fingers brushing the cold metal of his knife. His eyes scanned the parking lot, the darkness settling in around them like a predator waiting to pounce. We're not alone, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The bikers instantly dropped into position, forming a protective circle around the kids. Hawk's mind raced. Was this the backup from the factory's owners? Or had someone else heard about what was going on and decided to take action? Either way, they needed to be ready for anything. The engines grew louder, the sound vibrating through the ground beneath them. Hawk's eyes flicked back to the crew, then to Aisha, who was now holding her brother's hand tightly. He couldn't let anything happen to them, not now. As the motorcycles drew closer, Hawk gave a subtle signal to the crew. "Ready," he whispered. The roar of the engines grew deafening, and for a moment, it seemed like the world was closing in on them. And then, through the haze of the noise, they saw them. A dozen motorcycles, their headlights cutting through the dark like a herd of wolves on the hunt. Hawk's breath caught in his throat. They weren't just any bikers. These were the Serpents, the ones behind all of this. Hawk's fist clenched. He had known this was coming. He had been waiting for the other shoe to drop. He just didn't expect it to come so soon. The leader of the Serpents, a tall man with a cruel smile and tattoos snaking down his arms, stopped a few feet from them. He stared at Hawk for a long moment, sizing him up. "Thought you could just waltz in and take what's ours," the man sneered, his voice thick with malice. Hawk didn't flinch. "Your people aren't welcome here," he said evenly, his eyes locked on the man's. The Serpent leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the night. "You think you can stop us? You don't know who you're dealing with." Hawk didn't respond. There was no need. He had already made up his mind. This wasn't going to end peacefully. The bikers around them began to circle, their engines growling menacingly, the tension palpable. Hawk's fingers tightened around the handle of his knife. He knew this could get ugly fast, but he wasn't about to back down. He had a promise to keep. "Get the kids out of here," Hawk ordered his crew, never breaking eye contact with the Serpent leader. "I'll handle this." The group hesitated, but only for a moment. They knew better than to argue with Hawk when he gave an order. One by one, the bikers turned and began to move toward the exit, leading Aisha and her brother to safety. But Hawk stayed where he was, staring down the Serpent leader. He wasn't about to let this man get away with what he had done. The leader of the Serpents smirked, clearly thinking he had the upper hand. "You're making a big mistake, biker. This is bigger than you think." Hawk took a step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel beneath him. "It doesn't matter how big it is," he said, his voice low but steady. "You're not getting away with this." And with that, the first blow was struck. The fight was on. The fight erupted in an instant. The moment Hawk moved forward, the Serpent leader swung his fist with brutal force, aiming for Hawk's jaw. Hawk was faster. He ducked, feeling the wind from the punch rush past him. In one fluid motion, he countered, landing a powerful blow to the man's stomach. The Serpent leader grunted, stumbling back, but quickly regained his footing. His eyes were cold, filled with the kind of rage that only came from being exposed. "You're going to regret this," the leader snarled, wiping blood from his mouth. Hawk didn't say a word. He wasn't here for threats. The group of Serpents around him tightened their circle, their eyes scanning the bikers, their hands twitching as they reached for their weapons. Hawk's crew stayed back, watching, waiting for his signal. He needed to end this quickly before it spiraled out of control. With a swift move, Hawk grabbed the Serpent leader by the collar of his jacket and slammed him into the side of the factory wall. The impact reverberated through the building, making the dust settle around them. "This ends now," Hawk growled. The Serpent leader grinned, though it was clear he was struggling to stay upright. "You think you can stop us? We've been running this town for years." Hawk's expression hardened. "Not anymore," he said. With a quick twist, Hawk disarmed the man, knocking the gun from his hand before it could be used. The leader's eyes widened in surprise, but before he could react, Hawk pushed him away, his voice like ice. "Leave now, and you'll walk away. Stay, and you'll regret it." The Serpent leader stumbled back, his men shifting uneasily behind him. Hawk could see the hesitation in their eyes. They weren't used to backing down. They weren't used to losing. But Hawk wasn't about to let them intimidate him. He stepped forward, his stance firm and unwavering. "This is your last chance. Walk away, or I'll make sure you don't get another." The Serpent leader glared at Hawk, clearly weighing his options. For a moment, the two men stood in a tense standoff, the only sound the distant hum of the factory's machinery. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hawk could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure building with every passing second. And then, just as it seemed like the leader might make a move, something shifted. One by one, the Serpents stepped back, their shoulders slumping in defeat. Hawk didn't lower his guard. He had been in enough fights to know that even the slightest sign of weakness could turn the tide. But this time it was over. The serpent leader turned to his crew, his voice low but filled with venom. "This isn't over," he spat. "We'll be back." But before Hawk could respond, the leader spun on his heel and motioned for his men to follow him. The group of serpents retreated, leaving the parking lot in a cloud of dust. Hawk watched them go, making sure they didn't circle back. Once they were gone, he exhaled deeply, his body tense with the aftershock of the confrontation. He turned back to his crew, nodding for them to follow him. "Let's get the kids out of here." As they walked back toward the bikes, Hawk kept a watchful eye on the road ahead. He knew that even though the immediate danger had passed, there were still plenty of threats to deal with. This wasn't just about protecting the kids anymore. This was about sending a message. Hawk wasn't afraid to stand his ground, and he wasn't afraid to do whatever it took to make sure people were safe. The group moved quickly, their boots pounding against the pavement as they reached their motorcycles. Hawk mounted his bike, feeling the familiar weight of the machine beneath him. The engines roared to life, the sound reverberating through the night as they sped off into the darkness. Hawk kept his focus on the road ahead, his thoughts on the promise he had made and the people he had sworn to protect. It was far from over, but for now, they were safe. And that was enough. The roar of the motorcycles faded as they sped down the highway, but Hawk could still feel the tension in the air. The danger wasn't over. He knew it. The serpents had retreated for now, but they'd be back, and next time, it wouldn't be so easy. Hawk's grip on the handlebars tightened as they rode through the night. He kept his eyes scanning the road, always alert, always prepared for the next move. The kids were in the back of the pack, riding safely with the others. Hawk couldn't help but glance back at them every few minutes. Aisha and her brother, Jamal, were safe for now, but the fear still lingered in their eyes. He could see it in the way they clung to the other bikers, the way they looked around as if expecting danger to come at any moment. Hawk's heart went out to them. He had promised their father, his best friend, that he would keep them safe. And now, the weight of that promise felt heavier than ever. He could feel the unease gnawing at him, but he didn't let it show. He had a job to do. They needed to get to a safe place. As they approached the outskirts of town, Hawk motioned for the group to slow down. They couldn't risk drawing attention. The serpents had connections everywhere, and they wouldn't hesitate to call in reinforcements if they thought Hawk and his crew were weak. Hawk signaled for the bikers to pull off the road and into an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. As they parked their bikes, Hawk turned to the crew. "We need to stay low. No one goes anywhere alone. Keep your eyes peeled. We don't know how long we have before they come looking for us." The crew nodded, each of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had been through far worse than this. Hawk watched as they began to set up a perimeter around the warehouse, securing the area. Aisha and Jamal were already sitting on the steps, looking tired but relieved. Hawk walked over to them, his boots echoing in the quiet space. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes still filled with that haunted look. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hawk crouched down in front of her, his eyes softening. "For now," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But we need to stay ready. We can't let our guard down." Jamal, still clutching his sister's hand, looked up at Hawk with wide, scared eyes. "What happens now?" he asked. Hawk paused for a moment, taking a breath. "We wait," he said simply. "We regroup. And when the time comes, we make sure they never hurt anyone again." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Hawk knew the kids didn't fully understand the danger they were in, but they didn't need to. They just needed to know they were safe for now. And Hawk would do whatever it took to make sure that was the case. He stood up and turned to the rest of the crew. "Keep watch," he said, his voice carrying authority. "We'll need to be ready when they come for us. And when they do, we'll be ready." As the night wore on, the crew settled into their positions, watching the entrance to the warehouse and keeping an eye out for any movement. Hawk kept his eyes on the road, knowing that this was just the calm before the storm. He knew they wouldn't be safe for long. The serpents would be coming, and they would come with everything they had. Hawk had faced danger before, but this time was different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It was about keeping a promise to a friend, protecting innocent lives, and ensuring that the kids didn't end up like so many others who had been caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't ask for. As the hours passed, Hawk felt the weight of the situation settle in. They had done what they could, but the night wasn't over. And he wouldn't rest until he knew Aisha and Jamal were safe. His crew was ready. He was ready. And when the Serpents came, they would face them head-on, no matter what it took. The first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the warehouse, casting long shadows across the cold concrete floor. Hawk stood at the entrance, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel the tension building, the air thick with the promise of a fight that was coming. He had known this moment would come. The Serpents would return. It was just a matter of when. He checked his watch. It was just after 6 in the morning. The team had barely slept, but they didn't need to. They were ready. Hawk turned back to see his crew, each of them preparing in their own way. Some were checking their bikes, others cleaning their weapons, and a few were talking in low voices, making plans. The kids were still asleep, curled up in the corner. Aisha had fallen asleep holding Jamal close, both of them exhausted from the events of the past 24 hours. Hawk's heart softened as he looked at them. They were just kids, but the world they had been thrust into was anything but innocent. Hawk had been a soldier, a biker, and a protector for most of his life. But nothing had prepared him for this. Nothing had prepared him for the responsibility of these two kids, the weight of the promise he had made to their father. The door creaked open behind him, and Hawk turned to see one of the bikers, Valdez, approaching. "We've got movement," Valdez said, his voice low but urgent. A couple of cars pulling into the lot. "Looks like the Serpents brought backup." Hawk's jaw clenched. He had known it was only a matter of time before the Serpents called in reinforcements. He signaled to the rest of the crew, and they began to position themselves, quietly and efficiently. Hawk moved toward the kids, his steps measured and deliberate. He knelt down beside Aisha, gently shaking her shoulder. "Aisha, wake up," he said softly. Her eyes fluttered open, her face still drawn with fear and exhaustion. "We have to go. The Serpents are coming." Aisha's eyes widened as she sat up, looking around frantically for her brother. Jamal was still asleep beside her, but Aisha's grip tightened around him. "We'll keep you safe," Hawk assured her. "But we need to move fast. Grab what you can. We're leaving." The girl nodded, her face pale but determined. She gently shook her brother awake, and together they gathered their things, moving quickly. Hawk stood and turned to the rest of the crew. "Stay sharp," he ordered. "We're going to hold them off, but we're not sticking around. We get the kids out, and then we disappear." The crew nodded, moving into position. Hawk knew this was going to be a hard fight. The Serpents weren't going to let them leave without a fight. But Hawk wasn't afraid. He had faced worse, and he would face whatever came next. He just had to make sure the kids were safe. He could hear the engines now, the sound of the Serpents' motorcycles approaching. Hawk's grip tightened on his weapon as he moved toward the door, peering out through the cracks. The first thing he saw was a row of motorcycles, their engines rumbling as they rolled into the lot. It was them, the Serpents, and they had come in full force. Hawk's crew was already in position, waiting for the signal. He counted the bikes. 8, maybe 10. They had the numbers, but Hawk had the experience. He wasn't about to let them take the kids. As the Serpents pulled up, the lead biker, the same man who had been in charge the night before, dismounted. He looked around, his eyes narrowing as he saw Hawk standing at the door. "You're still here?" the leader sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Hawk didn't flinch. "You're not welcome here," he said calmly. The Serpent leader smirked, walking closer. "You really think you can protect them?" he asked, his voice laced with threat. Hawk stepped forward, his presence imposing. "I'm not protecting them," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm making sure you don't get away with this." The leader laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the still morning air. "You're too late," he said. "We've already taken what we want." Hawk's eyes flicked to his crew, and they shifted into position, surrounding the Serpents. "I'm not leaving without the kids," Hawk said. The tension in the air was palpable now, thick and heavy. The Serpents looked around, calculating their next move. Hawk wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't back down. The kids needed him, and he wasn't going to let them down. The standoff lasted only a few moments, but to Hawk, it felt like an eternity. Finally, the Serpent leader raised his hand, signaling his crew. "You want to do this the hard way?" he asked. "Fine." Hawk's heart raced, and he could feel the adrenaline beginning to surge. The time for talk was over. The fight was coming. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hawk stood at the front of the group, his eyes locked on the serpent leader. Every biker in the lot was poised, ready for the fight that was about to unfold. Hawk could feel his pulse quicken, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He had faced down gangs, criminals, and more, but this was different. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about protecting the innocent, keeping a promise. The serpent leader smirked, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Hawk. The leader's crew stood at the ready, their hands twitching toward weapons, but Hawk knew they would hesitate. They always did when it came to a fight like this. Hawk didn't hesitate. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke. "This ends here," he said, his gaze unwavering. The serpent leader laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You think you can stop us? You're outnumbered, outgunned, and outclassed." Hawk's jaw tightened. He didn't care about numbers. He didn't care about guns. What mattered was the people behind him, the kids he had promised to protect. "I'm not here to play games," Hawk said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "You'll leave now, or we'll make you." The serpent leader's smirk faded slightly, and Hawk saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't as confident as he wanted to appear. The standoff stretched for a few more moments, the sound of distant motorcycles echoing in the silence. Hawk's crew stayed silent, their eyes trained on the serpents, ready for anything. The leader's crew looked uneasy, glancing between Hawk and their boss. They had been through countless fights, but something about this felt different. They knew they weren't just dealing with any biker. They were dealing with someone who would stop at nothing to protect those under his care. Finally, the leader threw his hands up in mock surrender. "Fine," he said with a sneer. "You want to do this the hard way? Let's see how long you last." With that, he motioned to his crew, and the serpents began to move, their motorcycles roaring to life. Hawk didn't hesitate. He raised his hand, signaling to his crew to advance. The bikers on Hawk's side immediately revved their engines, the sound of their motorcycles filling the air like thunder. In a flash, they surged forward, a wall of leather and steel, intent on protecting the kids and driving the serpents back. The fight broke out almost instantly. The sound of fists striking flesh, the crack of helmets colliding, the screeching of tires on gravel. Hawk moved swiftly through the chaos, his focus unshaken. He ducked and dodged as fists flew past him, his own blows landing with precision, sending serpents stumbling back. Every move he made was calculated. Every strike was meant to incapacitate, not kill. He wasn't here to start a war. He was here to end it. The serpent leader charged toward him, a knife drawn and gleaming in the morning light. Hawk was ready. As the leader lunged, Hawk sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it until the knife dropped to the ground. With a swift move, Hawk disarmed him completely, sending the leader crashing to the ground. The fight was intense, but Hawk could see the tide turning. His crew was pushing the serpents back, forcing them to retreat. It wasn't over yet, though. The serpent leader, now on the ground, glared at Hawk, his face red with fury. "This isn't over," he spat, struggling to get back to his feet. Hawk stepped forward, towering over him. "It is for you," he said quietly. The leader's eyes burned with hatred, but he knew the fight was lost. His men were retreating, and there was nothing left to do. Hawk wasn't going to let them get away this time. He looked over at his crew, giving them a nod. "We're done here," Hawk said, his voice calm and steady. The serpents backed off, not daring to challenge them further. As they mounted their motorcycles and rode off, Hawk watched them disappear into the distance. He could feel his heart still pounding in his chest, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade. But it wasn't over. He knew it. The serpents would regroup, but they would never forget the lesson they had learned today. Hawk had made it clear. The kids were off limits. He had kept his promise. As the rest of the crew began to regroup, Hawk turned to the kids. Aisha was still holding Jamal, her face a mixture of fear and relief. "Are we safe now?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Hawk knelt down in front of her, offering a reassuring smile. "For now, yeah," he said. "But we need to keep moving. The fight isn't over." Aisha nodded, her eyes full of trust. She had seen Hawk's strength, his resolve. She knew they would make it. As the crew began to prepare for the next leg of their journey, Hawk's mind was already working. He didn't know what the serpents would do next, but he knew they wouldn't stop. But neither would he. Not until every promise he made was kept. The morning light was starting to filter through the cracks in the warehouse, but Hawk could already feel the weight of the day pressing on him. The Serpents had backed off, but Hawk knew that was only temporary. They had made their stand today, but the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Hawk turned to his crew, making sure everyone was ready. They had taken a hard hit, but no one was down for long. Each of the bikers was focused, determined. They were family, and they would fight to the end for each other. But Hawk knew he couldn't keep the kids in this kind of danger for much longer. He had to get them out of town. He couldn't afford to put them at risk again. The kids had been through enough. He glanced at Aisha and Jamal. Aisha was still holding on to her brother, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She was tough, he could see that. But Hawk knew that beneath the surface, she was terrified. She had just seen the world she knew shatter, and now she had no idea what would come next. Hawk knelt down in front of them, his voice soft but steady. "We're going to get you somewhere safe, all right?" Aisha nodded, her eyes still wide, but there was a flicker of trust in them now. "You promise?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hawk smiled at her, the warmth in his eyes steadying her. "I promise," he said, his voice low and firm. "But we need to keep moving. We don't have much time." The kids stood up, and Hawk motioned to the rest of the crew to follow him. They had to get out of the warehouse and head for the safer route, away from the eyes of the Serpents. Hawk wasn't about to let them regroup and come after them again. It wasn't safe. He moved swiftly, taking the lead, and his crew fell in behind him. The sound of the motorcycles starting up filled the air, a signal that they were about to ride out. Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He'd been in enough fights to know that a single misstep could cost them everything. They needed to be smart about this. They needed to disappear. The streets were quiet as they made their way through the back alleys, away from the main roads. Hawk kept his eyes moving, scanning every corner for potential threats. It was only a matter of time before the Serpents figured out where they were heading. Hawk's hand tightened around the grip of his bike, the engine roaring beneath him as they picked up speed. The road was still empty, but Hawk knew they had to keep up the pace. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that the Serpents would catch up. He looked back at Aisha and Jamal, who were riding with one of the bikers, their faces tense, but determined. They had been through hell, but they were still standing. Hawk admired their strength. They were strong, but even the strongest needed protection. As they continued down the road, the sound of tires against asphalt was the only noise in the otherwise silent morning. Hawk's mind was working, calculating their next move. They needed to find a safe house, somewhere off the grid where the Serpents couldn't find them. They couldn't stay in the city. They needed distance. Hawk knew that the farther they got from the Serpents' reach, the safer they would be. But he also knew that there was no such thing as perfect safety. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now. The sky above them was clear, the morning sun rising higher, but the sense of impending danger still hung heavy. Hawk's instincts were telling him that trouble was coming. The sound of a distant engine reached his ears, and Hawk's head snapped up. His heart skipped a beat. A single motorcycle was approaching from behind. Hawk's eyes narrowed. It wasn't one of his crew. It was too early for anyone else to be on the road. He signaled to his crew to slow down, and the group fell into a defensive formation, ready for whatever was coming. The motorcycle grew louder, and soon, it was right behind them. Hawk didn't need to turn around to know that the rider was closing in. He could feel the presence behind him, the threat growing with every second. The motorcycle pulled up alongside him, and Hawk finally turned to face it. The rider's face was obscured by a helmet, but Hawk could see the glint of a knife strapped to the rider's leg. The Serpents hadn't given up. Hawk's pulse quickened. He wasn't going to let them take the kids. He wasn't going to let anyone harm them. Not on his watch. The rider revved the engine, leaning in close to Hawk, as if trying to intimidate him. "You think you've won?" the rider called out, the voice muffled through the helmet. Hawk's eyes locked onto the rider, and without hesitation, he revved his own engine, pulling ahead in a burst of speed. He needed to keep moving. They needed to get to safety. The chase was on. Hawk pushed the bike faster, his grip tightening as the road ahead blurred. He glanced back, to see the rider closing the gap. The Serpents weren't done yet. But Hawk wasn't about to give up. Not now. He would protect the kids at all costs. He would face whatever came next, no matter how difficult. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sound of the motorcycle engines roared through the morning air, louder now as the chase intensified. Hawk's heart pounded in his chest, his eyes focused on the road ahead, the wind whipping past him. The Serpent Rider was still close, too close. Hawk could feel the heat from the engine as it edged up beside him. He leaned into the bike, his body instinctively shifting to cut the wind, making himself as small as possible. The rider was gaining ground, inch by inch. Hawk's thoughts raced. They couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not with Aisha and Jamal depending on them. The Serpent didn't care about the kids. They cared about retribution. Hawk wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. With a sharp twist of the throttle, Hawk surged forward, pushing his bike to its limits. The engine screamed as he raced down the highway, the sound of the rival bike still in his ear. He stole a glance back. The rider was close enough now that Hawk could see the gleam of a knife strapped to his leg. Hawk's grip tightened on the handlebars. If it came to it, Hawk was ready. But he wasn't planning on letting it get to that point. He needed to lose the rider. There was a stretch of road up ahead, a sharp curve with a steep incline. If he could make it, the rider wouldn't be able to follow so easily. Hawk knew he had one chance. He gunned the engine, sending his bike into a full sprint. The sound of his motorcycle tore through the silence of the highway, the engine growling beneath him. He could feel the bike responding, the weight of the machine like a second skin. As he approached the curve, he shifted his weight, steering the bike with precision, cutting through the corner with expert control. He barely noticed the sharp incline ahead, the road bending sharply as it dipped into a narrow pass. Hawk could hear the Serpent Rider's engine behind him, but he wasn't looking back anymore. He was focused solely on the road, the steep curve coming up fast. His body instinctively adjusted, leaning into the bike, trusting the machine to carry him through. As the road curved, Hawk's mind was clear. He wasn't going to lose this fight. The Serpent Rider had been close, but Hawk had one thing the rider didn't: experience. He knew how to take risks and get out unscathed. He hit the incline and pushed the throttle harder, the bike surging up the hill, gaining momentum. The wind blasted against his face as he leaned further into the turn, navigating the tight curve with ease. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the Serpent Rider's bike wobble as the rider tried to keep up, struggling to make the sharp turn. Hawk's grin was brief but determined. He knew it was only a matter of time before the rider would have to fall back. The Serpent wasn't used to this kind of riding. As expected, Hawk's bike shot out ahead, the incline helping him gain the edge. He could see the rival bike in his mirror, but the rider was losing ground fast. Hawk didn't slow down. He kept pushing, feeling the thrill of the chase and the knowledge that this was their moment. The road ahead straightened, and Hawk knew they had left the rider behind. It wouldn't be long before the Serpents realized they'd been outmaneuvered. But Hawk wasn't stopping. He couldn't afford to. He glanced back one last time, seeing the rider fading into the distance. His grip on the handlebars loosened slightly as he exhaled, letting the tension leave his body. The danger was far from over, but for now, they were safe. Hawk turned his focus back to the road. They needed to find a safe place to lay low, to plan their next move. The Serpents wouldn't give up easily. The thought lingered in Hawk's mind. He wasn't naive enough to think the chase was over. The Serpents would be back, and when they came, they would come with everything they had. But Hawk was ready for that. He had the experience, the crew, and the resolve to stand his ground. A few miles down the road, Hawk signaled to the crew to slow down. They had made it. The sun was fully up now, casting a warm light across the landscape. Hawk turned off the road and into a wooded area, leading his crew to a secluded spot where they could rest and regroup. He needed to give the kids a break. Aisha and Jamal were still shaken, their faces pale from the tension of the chase. But they had made it through. They were alive. And that's all that mattered for now. As the crew dismounted, Hawk went over to Aisha and Jamal, who were sitting on the ground, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhaustion. Hawk crouched down in front of them, offering a rare smile. "You two did good back there," he said, his voice gentle. Aisha nodded, her eyes still looking for reassurance. "Are we safe now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hawk's smile faded slightly. "For now, yeah," he said. "But we can't stay here long. We've got to keep moving." He turned to the crew, who had already begun to set up a perimeter. "We need to rest, but only for a short time. The Serpents will be coming for us again. And next time, we won't have the same luck." As Hawk stood up and walked away, he glanced back at the kids. They were safe, but Hawk couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had to protect them, He had to make sure the serpents never got their hands on them again. The sun hung low in the sky as Hawk watched his crew prepare. The moment of peace they had earned was fleeting, but they needed it. They needed to recover, to regroup. Hawk stood at the edge of the woods, his eyes scanning the horizon. The dust from the serpent chase still hung in the air, a reminder of the danger they had narrowly escaped. But Hawk knew the real fight was just beginning. He could feel it in his gut. The serpents weren't going to stop. They were ruthless, and they would come after them again, harder this time. They knew where Hawk and his crew were now, and they wouldn't stop until they had taken what they wanted. Hawk turned back to the campfire, where Aisha and Jamal were sitting. The kids had been through so much, and yet, they were still here, still holding on. Aisha looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "Do you think they'll come for us again?" she asked, her voice quiet. Hawk crouched down in front of her, his expression softening. "Yes," he said simply. "But we won't let them. We'll keep moving, keep staying ahead of them. We'll get you to safety, I promise." Jamal, who had been sitting silently next to his sister, looked up at Hawk, his small face full of questions. "What happens if they find us?" he asked. Hawk paused for a moment, searching for the right words. "Then we fight," he said quietly. "But I'll make sure you're safe. I won't let them hurt you." The weight of his promise hung in the air, heavy and true. Hawk knew that his words couldn't guarantee safety, but they were the best he could offer. And sometimes, that was all anyone could give. As Hawk stood up, he glanced over at his crew. They were preparing their bikes, checking their gear, making sure everything was in working order. Every biker knew that once they hit the road again, it would be a dangerous ride. They were on the move again, and they had to be ready for anything. Hawk felt the tension in the air, the pressure of responsibility pressing down on him. He had promised to protect these kids, and he wasn't going to let them down. Not now. Not ever. The sound of a distant engine broke the quiet, and Hawk's head snapped up. His instincts went on high alert. It was a single bike, its engine humming steadily in the distance. Hawk's crew immediately stopped what they were doing, their heads turning toward the sound. It was too early for anyone else to be out here. Hawk motioned for everyone to stay low, signaling them to form a perimeter. The rider wasn't one of theirs. That much was clear. Hawk's hand went to the gun at his waist, the cool metal grounding him. His mind raced. Was it a serpent scout? Or was it someone else who had heard the commotion from earlier? Either way, they couldn't take any chances. Hawk slowly made his way toward the edge of the clearing, keeping low to the ground, his eyes scanning the tree-line. He could hear the bike getting closer. The sound of the engine grew louder, and Hawk's heart began to race. The last thing he needed was another encounter right now. He didn't want to risk putting Aisha and Jamal in danger again. The bike came into view, its headlights cutting through the shadows of the trees. Hawk's hand tightened around his weapon. He was ready to move, ready to defend. But as the bike emerged from the tree line, Hawk's eyes narrowed. It wasn't a serpent. It wasn't even a stranger. It was one of his own. The biker pulled up to the camp, his face hidden beneath a helmet, but the insignia on his vest gave him away. Hawk relaxed, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The biker dismounted, walking toward Hawk. "What's the situation?" the man asked, his voice low and steady. Hawk looked him over quickly, nodding. "We've got a few hours before we need to move again," he said. "We'll rest, but not for long. The serpents will be back, and when they come, we have to be ready." The biker nodded. "Got it. We'll keep watch." Hawk turned back to Aisha and Jamal, who were sitting by the fire, their faces tired but hopeful. He couldn't show them the fear that was gnawing at him. He had to keep it together. For their sake. "We need to keep moving," Hawk said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We can't stop now." The rest of the crew was ready. They understood the stakes. They had all been through enough to know that this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to protect what was left of their world. They had made it this far, but Hawk knew that the real test was still ahead. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The next time the serpents came, they would come in full force. But Hawk wasn't about to let that happen. He had made a promise to keep the kids safe. And he wasn't going to let anyone, no matter how dangerous, tear that promise apart. The group moved quietly through the woods, the sound of their boots muffled by the soft earth beneath them. Hawk led the way, his senses sharp, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The last few hours had been tense, the adrenaline from their last encounter still coursing through his veins. He could feel the weight of the promise he had made to the kids heavy on his shoulders. Aisha and Jamal were still with them, but their faces were etched with fear and exhaustion. Hawk knew it wasn't enough to just keep them safe for now. He had to make sure they had a future, one where they weren't constantly looking over their shoulders, waiting for the serpents to strike again. The night had fallen, and the full moon cast a pale light over the forest, casting long shadows across the path ahead. Hawk signaled for the group to stop. They had reached the edge of the woods, and now they had to make their next move. "We're close," Hawk said quietly, turning to the crew. "We'll set up camp here for the night, but we move at first light. The serpents won't be far behind, and we can't afford to stay in one place too long." The crew nodded, each of them moving to their assigned tasks. Some set up a perimeter, others checked their bikes, and a few took a moment to rest, knowing they would be on the move again soon. Hawk went over to Aisha and Jamal, who were sitting by a small fire. Aisha was clutching her brother tightly, her eyes still wide with fear, but there was a flicker of trust in them now. She had seen Hawk in action, had seen the way he protected her brother, and in that, there was a kind of reassurance. "Are we going to be okay?" Aisha asked softly, her voice trembling just a little. Hawk crouched down in front of her, his voice steady and calm. "We're going to be okay," he said, his words carrying more weight than he intended. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear that still lingered beneath the surface. But he couldn't lie to her. He couldn't tell her everything would be perfect. The world wasn't perfect. But as long as they had each other, as long as they had people like him in their corner, they could survive. Hawk's eyes moved to Jamal, who was looking at him with a mix of curiosity and fear. "How about you, Jamal?" Hawk asked, his voice softer now. "You okay?" Jamal nodded, though his small frame seemed to shrink slightly. "I'm okay," he said, but his voice wavered slightly. Hawk knew he was lying, but he didn't push. The boy had been through too much already. "Good," Hawk said, offering him a reassuring smile. "You're a tough kid. You've got a good sister too." Aisha smiled at that, the tension in her shoulders easing just a little. Hawk stood up, glancing around at the crew. They had to keep moving, but this moment, this brief pause, was important. They had all been through a lot, and for the kids, it was a chance to catch their breath. For Hawk, it was a moment of reflection. The road ahead was still long and dangerous. The serpents weren't done with them, not by a long shot. But Hawk wasn't about to back down. He had seen too many things, been through too many battles, to turn tail now. The promise he had made to the kids, to their father, was his to keep. He would see this through, no matter what. As the fire crackled, Hawk's thoughts drifted back to the road ahead. They needed to get to safety, but Hawk knew that even once they were safe, they wouldn't be free. There would always be someone else, some other threat waiting in the shadows. But they would face it together. Hawk turned to the crew, giving them a nod. "All right, let's get some rest," he said. "We'll hit the road at first light. Stay alert. We'll make it through this." The crew didn't question him. They knew he was right. They knew the fight wasn't over. But for tonight, they could rest. Hawk glanced back at the kids one last time before he stepped away to check on the perimeter. Aisha and Jamal were huddled together by the fire, their faces still full of fear, but Hawk could see something else there too. Hope. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. And for Hawk, that was enough for now. They would keep moving. They would survive. And when the serpents came, they would be ready. The first rays of the sun were beginning to break through the trees as Hawk and his crew prepared to leave. The night had been long, filled with tension and quiet moments of reflection. The serpents hadn't found them, but Hawk knew it was only a matter of time before they tried again. The plan was simple. Keep moving, stay one step ahead. Hawk wasn't taking any chances. Aisha and Jamal were still sleeping, their faces peaceful for the moment, free from the fear they had carried with them for so long. Hawk couldn't help but glance over at them. They had lost so much already, and yet they were still standing. He had promised their father, his best friend, that he would protect them, and Hawk wasn't going to break that promise. The rest of the crew was already checking their bikes and making sure everything was in working order. There was no time to waste. Hawk moved over to his bike, adjusting his gear and making sure his weapons were secure. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The serpents would stop at nothing to find them. Hawk glanced back at Aisha and Jamal, who were now awake, sitting by the fire and quietly talking. They looked up when they saw Hawk approach, and for a moment, Their eyes met, full of unspoken words. Aisha smiled faintly. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice still carrying that trace of uncertainty. Hawk crouched down in front of them, his face softening. "We're going to find a place where you can be safe," he said, his voice low and steady. "But we need to keep moving, all right? The serpents won't stop until they get what they want." Aisha nodded, looking over at Jamal, who clung to her side. He was quieter than usual, his face pale from the stress of the past few days. Hawk could see the weight of everything they had been through on their faces. "We won't stop until we're safe," Hawk added, his voice firm. "I promise." Aisha's eyes softened, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax a little. Jamal squeezed her hand, still unsure, but trusting Hawk's words. Hawk stood up and motioned for the crew to get ready. "We move out in 5, he said, and the crew responded immediately, preparing for the next leg of the journey. They had been on the move for days, and Hawk knew they couldn't stay in one place for too long. The serpents would be hunting them down, and they needed to keep their distance. Hawk led the crew back onto the road, his bike roaring to life as they made their way through the winding paths. The air was still cool, the trees towering around them, but Hawk's mind was elsewhere. He was already thinking about the next step, where they could go, how they could stay ahead of the serpents. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over at the rest of the crew, making sure everyone was in position. The road ahead seemed quiet, but Hawk knew that didn't mean they were safe. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. As they moved forward, Hawk's mind was racing. He needed to find a place where they could regroup, somewhere off the beaten path. But every option felt risky. The more remote the location, the more vulnerable they would be. It was a delicate balance, and Hawk wasn't sure they had time for it. He glanced back at Aisha and Jamal, who were riding in the middle of the group. They had been through so much already, and Hawk's heart ached for them. They didn't deserve this. No child did. The road began to curve, and Hawk's focus snapped back to the task at hand. They were getting closer to the highway, and that's when it happened. The sound of a motorcycle engine roared from behind them. Hawk's heart skipped a beat. He glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing. It wasn't just one bike. There were more. A lot more. The serpents had found them. Hawk's pulse quickened, and he immediately signaled to the crew to speed up. "We've got company," he shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. The bikes roared to life as the crew picked up speed, trying to outrun the approaching danger. Hawk's mind raced as he calculated their options. The highway ahead was clear, but there were no safe places to hide. They would have to make a stand. "We fight," Hawk said, his voice low but resolute. He knew they couldn't outrun the serpents now. They would need to hold their ground. The sound of the serpents' engines grew louder, and Hawk could see them closing in. The moment of truth was here. Hawk's grip on the handlebars tightened as he prepared for the fight ahead. The serpents wouldn't just back down, and neither would he. He had promised Aisha and Jamal that they would be safe, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. "Stay close," Hawk told the crew. "We'll make them regret this." The group formed up, positioning themselves in a defensive line. Hawk's mind was clear now, focused entirely on the battle ahead. He had been in enough fights to know how it worked. And this time, he wouldn't let the serpents take what wasn't theirs. The roar of the serpents' motorcycles echoed through the trees as Hawk and his crew braced for the fight that was about to unfold. The group formed a defensive line, their bikes lined up in a row, ready to stand their ground. Hawk's eyes locked on the oncoming riders, his body tense, every muscle coiled and ready for action. They were outnumbered, but Hawk wasn't worried. He had fought worse battles before, and he knew his crew was strong. They had fought for each other, and they would fight again today. The sound of the engines grew louder as the serpents closed in, their motorcycles kicking up dust in their wake. Hawk didn't flinch. He had made a promise to Aisha and Jamal, and he wasn't going to let anything or anyone break that. The serpents, led by their leader, came to a stop just a few yards away, their bikes growling like wild animals. The leader dismounted, his eyes filled with rage as he surveyed the scene. Hawk could see the contempt in the man's gaze, but he didn't let it faze him. "You really think you can stop us?" The serpent leader sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Hawk's expression remained unchanged. "You've been warned," he said quietly. "Leave now, and maybe you'll walk away. Stay, and you'll regret it." The leader's lip curled into a snarl. "You're a fool, biker," he spat. "You think you can stand against us? We'll wipe you out, just like we've done to everyone else. Hawk stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. Not today, he said. The leader's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for his men to dismount. The serpents spread out, ready to attack, but Hawk was prepared. His crew moved in sync with him, their eyes sharp, their bodies tense. Hawk signaled for the rest of the group to hold their ground, while he took a few steps toward the leader. This ends today, Hawk said, his voice unwavering. The leader smirked, drawing a knife from his belt. You really want to make this a fight, huh? Hawk didn't flinch. He knew that the leader was trying to intimidate him, but he wasn't going to back down. The leader lunged forward, the blade gleaming in the sunlight, but Hawk was faster. In a blur of motion, Hawk sidestepped and grabbed the man's arm, twisting it until the knife dropped to the ground. The serpent leader grunted in pain but tried to break free, but Hawk's grip was unyielding. With a swift move, Hawk slammed the leader into the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. The fight had started, and Hawk wasn't going to let up. The serpents surrounding him rushed forward, but Hawk and his crew fought back with a fury that matched their determination. The sound of fists meeting flesh, the crunch of boots on gravel, the screeching of motorcycles, it all blended together into a chaotic symphony of battle. Hawk's crew held their ground, never faltering. They fought like a unit, each one watching the other's back. Hawk could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins as he moved through the fight, knocking serpents down one by one. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the kids, for the promise he had made to protect them. Every punch, every kick, every movement was calculated. The serpents were strong, but Hawk and his crew were stronger. The leader, struggling beneath Hawk, snarled in frustration. You can't win this, he gritted through clenched teeth. Hawk looked down at him, his face cold and resolute. We already have, he said. Just then, a loud crash interrupted the fight. One of the serpents had managed to knock a bike out of position, and the bike skidded across the gravel, knocking several of their men off balance. The serpents faltered for just a moment, and Hawk saw the opportunity. He moved swiftly, using the distraction to throw the leader off him and land a final blow that sent the man sprawling to the ground. The fight continued for a few more minutes, but the serpents, now on the defensive, started to retreat. One by one, they fell back, unwilling to fight any longer. Hawk stood in the center of the chaos, his breath heavy, his body aching from the battle. His crew gathered around him, their faces set with determination. The serpents had been beaten, but Hawk knew it wasn't over. The road ahead would still be filled with danger. But for now, they had won. Hawk turned to Aisha and Jamal, who had been watching from the side, their faces full of awe and relief. They were safe, for now. Hawk walked over to them, offering a reassuring smile. You two okay? He asked, his voice soft. Aisha nodded, her face still pale but showing a faint smile. We're okay, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of everything they had been through. Jamal, still clinging to his sister, gave a small nod as well. Hawk's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. They had made it. They were still standing, and that was what mattered. As the crew gathered around, Hawk gave them a nod of approval. We're not done yet, he said. But for now, we've earned a break. The sound of the bikes starting up filled the air, and Hawk led the group toward the road. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The serpents would regroup, but Hawk was ready for whatever came next. He had made a promise, and he would keep it, no matter what. I hope you are ready for an intense ride through the thrilling world of Hell Angel stories. In this gripping tale, Hawk, a seasoned biker, and his crew must navigate the dangers of protecting two innocent kids, Aisha and Jamal, from the relentless pursuit of the serpents, a ruthless gang determined to get their hands on them. As Hawk leads his crew through tough decisions, unexpected battles, and moments of tension, the Hell Angel stories unfold with action-packed scenes and raw emotions. With every twist and turn, the stakes grow higher as the serpents close in, but Hawk and his crew never back down. The narrative takes you on a high-speed chase, where survival, loyalty, and promises made to protect the innocent are put to the ultimate test. Hell Angel stories are never simple, and Hawk's determination to shield Aisha and Jamal from harm shows that the road to safety is anything but easy. With the fight intensifying, Hawk proves that the Hell Angels are not just bikers. They are a force to be reckoned with. From high-speed chases to close combat, this story explores the unbreakable bond of brotherhood and the lengths one will go to protect the ones they love. As the serpents close in, Hawk must make difficult choices, knowing that the journey is far from over. Hell Angel stories are filled with unexpected surprises, and this one is no exception. The adrenaline-fueled scenes will keep you on the edge of your seat as Hawk and his crew face danger head-on, ready to defend what is rightfully theirs. In the end, these Hell Angel stories leave us with the powerful message that no matter the odds, true protectors will always fight to the end, no matter the cost.